Hello and welcome to my weekly podcast through the Bible in 10 plus years. I'm going to take another slight diversion. Today is Ascension Day, and so I want to go to Acts for at least a few weeks. Who knows, maybe 28 weeks. I've already done explanatory notes on Acts, but I want to start a new series today called Stuff You Didn't Know About Acts. Now, maybe you did know it, and frankly, some of it's debatable, so maybe it isn't stuff to know. Thoughts on Acts. But I want to start today with Acts chapter 1. Stuff you didn't know about Acts chapter 1. Or maybe you did. So, for example, did you know that Acts is addressed to a man named Theophilus? Now, he could be lover of God, is what the word means. Some have suggested it's not a real person. I'm a real boy, but I'm a real Roman official. But that Theophilus is actually a cipher for anybody who loves God. Now, I don't go with that theory. For one thing, Luke calls him most excellent Theophilus. And most excellent is used of a Roman governor later on in the book of Acts. So I can't prove it, I like the theory that Theophilus is a Roman official. I don't like the theory that the book of Acts is a kind of amicus brief for Paul's trial before Nero or a Roman official in Rome. I don't like that theory. For one thing, I don't think that the dating of Acts fits with that. Now, I know there's a book out recently arguing that pretty much everything in the New Testament was written before 70 AD. I find this an unfathomable hypothesis, particularly if you take the book of Acts, if you take Luke, Acts is a connection, right? Acts is volume 2 of Luke. Who knew? There's stuff you didn't know. Luke is volume 2. Luke almost certainly used Mark as a source. And when we look at the way that Luke has slightly modified Mark 13 with regard to the destruction of Jerusalem, I won't go into it. I've done an introduction on Acts, I think, elsewhere. If not, I will eventually. I think the way that Luke has edited Mark very, very strongly suggests that the book of Acts was written after the destruction of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. And so that would put Acts too late to be any help to Paul when he appeared on trial before Nero. So I don't buy that at all. In fact, I don't think that's likely in the slightest that Acts was written in preparation for Paul's trial. I wonder actually if Theophilus is not only a Roman official but the patron for the creation of Luke Acts. I don't know if you've heard of Virgil's Aeneid. The Aeneid was written just slightly before Christ, dedicated to the first Roman emperor Augustus, and funded by a rich man named Maecenas. Maecenas funded for Virgil to write this in honor of Augustus. Virgil's Aeneid, one of the most famous, perhaps the most famous Roman piece of literature. And I wonder if something similar is going on here. Again, can't prove it. But that Theophilus is Luke's patron, and that Luke is writing Luke Acts for Theophilus, in honor of Theophilus. That this is therefore a work of art. Yes, it is meant to inform Theophilus of things that have happened recently, but it also suggests that there is a bit of delight and artistry involved to Luke Acts, that it is meant to please and to present truth, of course, that something can be true and pleasing, eh? A lecture doesn't have to be horrible. It can be pleasing too. Learning can be engaging. So I wonder if Theophilus was actually the patron who commissioned and in whose honor Luke is writing Luke Acts. Well, can't prove it. One of the interesting things about Acts 1 is that all of a sudden we have 40 days in between Jesus' resurrection and his ascension. It comes out of nowhere, right? I mean, it's mentioned nowhere else in the Bible. It's not mentioned in Matthew. It's not mentioned in Mark. It's not mentioned in John. And here's the kicker. It's not mentioned in Luke. We did Luke 24 a few weeks ago on Easter Sunday. And there are no 40 days in Luke 24. In fact, a straightforward reading of Luke 24 might give you the impression that Jesus rose from the dead and ascended to heaven on the same day. So these 40 days, you wonder, what is Luke's message with these 40 days? But in any case, 40 is, of course, a special number. But the 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension is a unique feature of the book of Acts. Up, and away. So Jesus ascends, he goes up through the clouds. which all seems in order, right? I got to reflecting on that once upon a time. The earth is actually a globe that's rotating, and I don't think heaven is up. God created the universe out of nothing. So that suggests that God's essence is somewhere other than this universe, right? Having grown up with a little bit of Star Trek, I always assumed that heaven was in another dimension. I read a Christian comic book when I was a boy, and it had, I remember there was this one play, I don't remember what the comic book was about, but there was this one scene where it said, here's a beautiful place in the galaxy, in the universe, look at this beautiful galaxy. Could this be where heaven is? And at the time, I thought, what are you talking about? Heaven's not in this universe. Heaven's outside this universe. Heaven's in some other dimension, Whatever the spiritual dimension is, it's not in the physical universe. Now, it's possible, actually, that heaven is part of this creation. Can we actually go where God's essence is outside this universe? Or is heaven some kind of a meta location? I still tend to think that heaven is in some other dimension of this universe. Although I have changed my mind a little bit about heaven, us going to be outside this universe where God is. I'm not sure if that's the way it works. But I don't think that heaven is in this visible universe. You can't get a telescope and say, oh, I see St. Peter up there. I don't think it works like that. And so back to Acts 1, what is Jesus doing when he goes up, and away? Why doesn't he transport or beam out? Or why doesn't he Doctor Strange, through a hole, and go there? And I think the answer is because that would be strange to the disciples. And so the disciples think the earth is flat, right? The disciples think that heaven is, you go up through a 7-layer salad to the highest top of the salad where God is, or maybe it's a 3-layer salad. We don't know exactly what, if you'd given a crayon, they didn't have crayons. If you'd given a stylus, to Peter and said, here, draw the universe, probably it would have been a flat earth with heaven straight up. I think that much is clear. So when Jesus goes up, he stoops to their weakness. He is meeting them where they're at within their framework of the world. I assume that what Jesus did is he gets up through the clouds and cut, and then he beams off to wherever heaven actually is. Stuff you didn't know. Interesting also in Acts 1, Paul would not qualify to be Judas's replacement. You hear this sometimes. It's a nice little ditty, isn't it? That Paul should have been the real replacement rather than Matthias of Judas. And so you hear that sometimes. And I understand that's a nice thought. I'm sure Paul is honored that you would think that. But of course, according to Acts 1, Paul would not qualify. Because according to Acts 1, the replacement for Judas has to have been somebody who'd been with Jesus since the time of John the Baptist. Paul, as far as we know, never even met or saw Jesus while he was on earth. Maybe he did, but we don't know. Certainly the Bible doesn't exactly record anything like that. Paul does say in 2 Corinthians, though we once knew him after the flesh, we don't know him now after the flesh. Some have thought, Paul had met him, but that's probably overreading that verse. Paul would not qualify. And so they pick Matthias as the replacement. Now, one interesting thing about Acts and other parts of the Bible is we should be careful to note that description is not necessarily prescription. Just because they did something doesn't mean that the Bible is endorsing what they did. That's especially interesting when you think about the fact that they cast lots to replace Judas. They threw dice, as it were. I would say this is a description of what they did, not a prescription of how we should do it. So when you're trying to decide what pastor, come on, snake eyes, I want Pastor Bob. It's probably not the way to do it. That was the way they did it in their culture. Who's going to be bishop? Who's going to be general superintendent? Come on, Wayne on too. Probably not the way to go about doing it. So just because they did it doesn't necessarily mean it's an endorsement. Description is not necessarily prescription. Acts 1 has an interesting description of Judas's death. He falls headlong and his bowels gush open. Well, this is interesting because, of course, in Matthew, Judas went out and hanged himself. And so did he hang himself? Did he fall off a cliff? I've heard harmonizations, he hanged himself on the top of a cliff, the rope broke, and then he fell headlong. Maybe, who knows? I think it's not wise, probably, to try to harmonize some of these things, because then you end up with it's not door number 1 and it's not door number 2. You create a door number 3 that's not in any of the stories. and it's more different than any of the stories. And so a lot of times when we try to harmonize accounts that we can't quite figure out how to fit together, we end up with a third something, a tertium quid, that actually is more different from the two original than they are from each other. We create our own Bible in our harmonization. I think it's better to just let them sit in tension with each other most of the time, rather than try to shove them together, unless there's an easy way to shove them together. We'll find out one day in heaven, I suppose, how they fit together. But I think we should also be careful to realize that ancient history writing did not feel the way that we would say, no, history, you have to go to the original sources and be very, very careful and scrupulous. And when you're not sure, make sure you make it clear you're not sure. There was a lot more artistry involved in the writing of history and in the ancient world. I don't think they were quite as bound to our make sure you get all the details exactly the way it happened and get eyewitness testimony. Although Luke says he has eyewitness testimony, but I'm saying we should be very careful not to assume that they did not feel free to introduce artistic elements into the story in order to enhance the message, in order to bring out truths and so forth. Their standards for history writing were not exactly the same as our cultural standards for history writing. Finally, I think that the New Testament authors felt free to read the Old Testament spiritually. They were good charismatics, or the old-fashioned holiness interpreters, who had no problem with hearing God's voice in a series of words that may have had nothing to do with what the original author was talking about. When my family was trying to decide whether we should move to Florida in 1970, I think it was, one of my family members, a stretch of words jumped out from Judges 1. Thou hast given me a southland. God wants us to move to Florida. Obviously, if you take a class in inductive Bible study, they'll tell you not to read the Bible that way. But I do think that the New Testament authors were more charismatic and spiritual in the reading of the Old Testament than they were necessarily inductive Bible study followers. I always think of when Matthew says, Jesus physically coming out of Egypt fulfilled the words, out of Egypt I called my son. If you go back to Hosea 11:1, it's not a prediction about the Messiah at all. It's talking about the Exodus. When Israel was a child, I called my son out of Egypt. And the more I called after them, the more they served other gods. Well, obviously that doesn't apply to Jesus. But so Matthew hears an echo of Jesus coming out of Egypt in Hosea 11:1, even though that's not what Hosea 11:1 was about. And so there are a couple of psalms that are quoted at the end of Acts 1. Let another take his place, let his place become desolate. Psalm 69:25, I think, and then maybe Psalm 108. The way that Acts takes those verses is not it's not entirely different from what they were saying. So Psalm 69 is generally talking about let the people who are persecuting the psalmist, let them be removed, as it were. And of course, Judas is done something bad to Jesus. So there is an analogy there. But of course, the psalm was not, again, a prediction exactly about Jesus. For one thing, the psalmist confesses his sin in Psalm 69. Obviously, Jesus didn't have any sin. And so it's okay, and we'll track this as we continue to go through Acts, that the New Testament authors felt free to read the Old Testament in a fuller sense, or a spiritual sense, in a way that was in various degrees of continuity and discontinuity with what the text originally had meant. Well, this has been my first Stuff You Didn't Know, or at least some things to think about in relation to Acts chapter 1. Yeah, there you have it. We'll see you next week on Stuff You Didn't Know about Acts 2.